I told my son I was giving away the hardware store on a Tuesday morning in April, and I watched his face for exactly 4 seconds before he said a single word. Because those 4 seconds tell you more about a man than 4 years of Sunday phone calls ever will. We were standing in the back office of Kessler Hardware, the store my father opened in 1971 and that I had run since 1994, surrounded by the same metal, shelving, and the same smell of cut key, blanks and fertilizer that had not changed since I was a boy sweeping the floor for $1 a week. I told him I had decided to donate the building and the business to the county's trade apprenticeship program. I told him it felt like the right way to close a chapter, and in those 4 seconds, before he recovered and said something appropriate about how generous that was, something moved across his face that I recognized because I had spent 30 years reading faces across a countertop, deciding who to extend credit to and who to turn away. What I saw in my son's face was not surprise. It was arithmetic. Welcome back to Hidden Justice. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because what happened over the next 6 weeks in my family will show you exactly how far some people will go when they think. No one is counting. Let's get into it. My name is Harold Voss. I'm 71 years old, and I've lived my whole life in Millbrook, Ohio, a town small enough that everyone at the diner still calls me Hal. My wife, Dorothy, passed 4 years ago, cancer, 17 months from diagnosis to the funeral, and I buried her in the plot next to my parents on a hill that looks down over the river she used to paint on Sunday afternoons when the store was closed. We had 2 children. My daughter Ellen lives 2 hours away in Columbus, married to a good man, raising 3 kids of her own, and she calls me every single week without fail. Not because she needs anything, but because that's who Dorothy raised her to be. My son Gary is 44, divorced, lives 15 minutes from me here in Millbrook. And Gary is the child I have spent most of my life worrying about in ways I never fully said out loud, because a father isn't supposed to admit that one child costs him more peace than the other. Gary is not a bad man. I want to say that clearly before I tell you anything else, because what I'm about to describe is not the story of a monster. It's the story of a man who has spent 20 years finding reasons why the next opportunity would finally be the one that worked, and who has never once in all those years connected the pattern to himself. 3 failed businesses, a landscaping company, a used car lot, a food truck that lasted 11 months. Each time I helped. Each time Dorothy told me gently that helping wasn't the same as fixing. And each time I told her I knew that. And each time I wrote another check anyway, because watching your son struggle does something to a chest that logic doesn't reach. After Dorothy died, Gary started coming around more, which I took at first as simple grief drawing us closer. The way grief sometimes does. He'd stop by the store on slow afternoons. He'd ask how I was holding up. And somewhere in the fall of last year, without my noticing exactly when it started, the visits began to include questions. Had I thought about what happens to the store when I'm gone? Had I talked to a lawyer about updating anything since Mom passed? Did I know that commercial property in this part of the county had gone up nearly 60% in the last 5 years? I answered honestly each time, because I had no reason not to. And it wasn't until January, 4 months ago, that I noticed the questions had a shape to them. The way water finds a shape when it's been dripping in the same spot long enough to wear a groove into stone. So I decided to find out what the groove actually meant. I didn't want to. I want to be honest about that, because there's a particular kind of loneliness in deciding you need to test your own son, in deciding that the easy trust you'd like to have isn't something you're allowed to have anymore until you know more. I told Gary and I told Ellen the same story, that I was donating the business to the county apprenticeship program, effective at the end of the year, no proceeds to either of them. The building and equipment gifted outright. I told them both on the same Tuesday, an hour apart, in the same back office, and I watched both of their faces the same way. Ellen's face did something simple. She looked surprised. Then she smiled, and she said, Dad, that's exactly the kind of thing Mom would have loved. Kids learning a trade in the building where you built your whole life. That's beautiful. She hugged me and asked if I needed help with any of the paperwork. And then she asked about my knee, because I'd mentioned it hurt in December, and that was the whole conversation. She left 20 minutes later to pick her kids up from practice. And if you had asked me in that moment which of my two children I understood completely, the answer would have been easy. Gary's face did the arithmetic I mentioned, and then he said, "Wow, Dad, that's really something. The community's lucky." He asked a few questions about the timeline, when exactly it would be finalized, whether the deed transfer needed anything from him as next of kin, whether I'd already signed with a lawyer or was still deciding who to use. I answered him plainly. I said Dorothy's old friend, an attorney named Ruth Callahan 2 towns over, was handling it, and that nothing was signed yet, that I was still in the deciding phase, giving myself through the end of the year to be sure. Gary nodded and said that made sense. No rush on something this big. Then he left, and I stood in the office where I've stood 10,000 times, and something in the 15 minutes I'd just spent sat wrong in my stomach, the way spoiled milk sits wrong before you've even placed the smell. Here's what I need you to understand about what happened 4 days later, because it's the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. I'd left my phone in the store office charging on a Saturday, run home for lunch, and Gary had stopped by to drop off a toolbox he'd borrowed. My part-time clerk, a 19-year-old named Denise, who's worked the counter for 2 summers, told me later that Gary had asked to use the store phone in the office because his cell had died, and she'd said, of course, not thinking twice about it, because it's his father's store and he's family. What she didn't know, and what I only pieced together a week later from the call log, was that in those 11 minutes alone in that office, Gary made 2 calls, one to a title company in Dayton, one to a man named Curtis Felt, whose name I recognized because Curtis Felt does one thing for a living, and that thing is buying commercial property fast, in cash, from owners who are motivated, elderly, or both. I didn't know any of that yet on the Saturday it happened. What I knew was that something felt off, and so on Monday I called the phone company and requested the itemized call log for the store's landline, telling them I suspected unauthorized long-distance charges, which wasn't exactly a lie, just not the whole truth. The log arrived by mail 6 days later. 2 calls, 11 minutes and 4 minutes, both placed during the window Denise remembered Gary being alone in that office. I sat at my kitchen table with that piece of paper and read the numbers 3 times before I let myself do what I did next, which was call the number belonging to Curtis Felt and ask, plainly, whether he had spoken with my son about the Kessler hardware property. Curtis Felt did not lie to me, and I want to give the man that much credit, because plenty of men in his line of work would have. He said Gary had called him directly, told him his father was an elderly widower planning to give away a piece of prime commercial real estate to a county program, instead of selling it, and asked whether Curtis would be interested in making an offer contingent on Gary being able to, in Gary's words, walk Dad back from the donation idea and get him thinking about a sale instead. Structured, so I handled the transaction as his agent. Curtis said he'd quoted a number, $710,000. Cash, with an 8% finders. Arrangement for Gary built. Into the structure as compensation for, again in Gary's words, managing my father's expectations. Curtis told me this over the phone in the flat. Unbothered tone of a man reciting a quarterly report, and every sentence landed in my chest like a step on a staircase I hadn't known was there, taking me somewhere I didn't want to go but couldn't stop descending toward. I sat with that phone call for 2 full days before I told anyone. I want to be honest that a part of me looked for an explanation that made it smaller than it was. Maybe Gary was just exploring options in case I changed my mind. Maybe the 8% was something Curtis exaggerated. But the itemized log didn't lie. And Curtis Felt's flat, bored recitation didn't sound like a man describing an exaggeration. It sounded like a man describing an ordinary Tuesday. which was the part that frightened me most. Not that my son had done this, but that arranging it had apparently cost him no visible effort at all. If you're still with me, drop a comment telling me what you'd have done in that kitchen. Because what I did next is the reason this story ends the way it does. I called Ruth Callahan, Dorothy's old friend. The attorney I'd told Gary was handling the donation, and I told her everything. Ruth had known our family for 30 years. She'd sat at our table for Thanksgiving more times than I could count. She listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers and good friends both know how to do. And when I finished, she asked one question. Hal, what do you actually want the outcome to be? Setting the legal part aside for a moment, I'd been turning that question over since the kitchen table. And here's what I'd landed on. I didn't want to destroy my son. I didn't want to stand up at some family gathering and read his sins aloud like a courtroom verdict. What I wanted was the truth to exist on paper before anyone could quietly rewrite it. And I wanted to understand, honestly, whether Gary was capable of telling me the truth himself if I gave him the room too. Ruth said she could help me get both. She recommended we finalize the apprenticeship, donation immediately, rather than waiting until year's end, filing the deed transfer with the county that same week, which would remove the property entirely from any possibility of sale before Gary or Curtis Felt could act on anything further. Second, she said, before we filed, she wanted to sit down with Gary herself as the attorney of record and simply ask him directly what his understanding of the transaction was on paper, so there would be a clean, honest record either way. The meeting happened on a Thursday in Ruth's office, a converted Victorian two towns, over with a fireplace that hadn't held a fire in years and a smell of old paper that I found oddly steadying. I sat in the corner. Ruth sat across from Gary. She told him plainly that she'd been made aware of a conversation with a buyer named Curtis Felt regarding a finder's arrangement tied to the Kessler property, and she asked him to explain, for the file, what that arrangement was. Gary's face did the arithmetic again, faster this time, and then something in it broke. Not dramatically, just a kind of air going out of a tire slowly enough that you don't hear the hiss until it's mostly flat. He looked at me, not Ruth, and he said, I wasn't trying to steal from you, Dad. I was trying to stop you from giving away something worth $700,000 to strangers when your own kid is struggling. I told myself I was protecting the family's interest. Ruth asked him gently whether he had planned to tell me about the finder's fee before or after any sale closed. Gary was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, after, in a voice smaller than I had heard from him since he was a boy, admitting to a broken window. I want to tell you what I felt sitting in that corner, because it wasn't the fury I expected. It was something closer to grief, the specific grief of watching a person you love confirm the worst version of a fear you'd hoped was unfair to have. I asked him one question. I said, Gary, if I had told you the truth in January, that I was thinking about donating the store, and you'd wanted to talk me out of it, why didn't you just say that to my face? He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, because every time I've come to you honestly needing something, it's felt like proof that I'm the son who can't manage his own life. I thought if I could just get you a better deal quietly, I could give you something instead of asking you for something. For once, Ruth filed the donation paperwork the following Monday. The building and business transferred to the county apprenticeship program free and clear. No sale, no finder's fee, nothing for Curtis Felt to structure. That part was not negotiable, and Gary never asked it to be, not once, which told me something too. What came after was harder to file cleanly, because you cannot notarize your way through the actual repair of a relationship. Gary and I have talked more in the 6 weeks since that Thursday than we talked in the 2 years before it. He's seeing a counselor now, something Ruth suggested, and something I paid for without hesitation. Because there's a difference between rescuing someone from consequences and helping someone build the tools to stop needing rescue in the first place. Ellen knows the whole story now, too. She wasn't angry at Gary so much as sad, and she told me something I've thought about every day since, which is that she and Gary had never once, in 40 years as siblings, actually talked honestly about how differently they'd learned to ask me for things. She learned to ask directly. He learned to manage. Last Sunday, all three of us sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I first read that itemized phone log, and Gary told me he'd applied for a position at the very apprenticeship program now, running out of the old store, teaching basic retail management to 19 and 20-year-olds starting their first jobs. He said something about wanting to be around the building without owning it, about learning what it felt like to build something slow and honest, instead of fast and clever. I don't know yet if it will stick. I've learned enough in 71 years not to promise an ending before it's actually arrived, but I know that Dorothy, who forgave our son 100 small failures over the years and never once stopped, believing there was a better version of him underneath the noise, would have told me that Thursday in Ruth's office was not an ending either. It was just the first Tuesday in a long time where nobody in my family was managing anybody else, and everybody was just telling the truth. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest. Hit that like button and subscribe, because Hidden Justice posts a new true family story every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.